Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. This is our early August podcast for 2023, and I'm your host, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group, a research and advisory firm. And joining me today from the conversation is our co-host, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst for the Sapient Insights Group. Welcome to the show, Cliff. What kind of teas are we going to have today? It seems like it's hot outside. Is it going to be just as hot on the news front?
Yeah,
right,
and we've got some great English tea. Actually, we're going to where most people think of tea. We've got some UK news. We've got some Swedish news. We're going to talk about some companies being acquired, some companies that are raising money. And that's going to actually lead into a conversation about some recurring topics that we've been on that are very important, such as AI and ChatGPT, but then about how that sort of fits into another trend over the last few years, which is remote working and how more prolific that is. And actually, speaking of prolific, we will be talking about them as a company, but do you want to start by talking about this Kahoot deal?
We can. I'm just thinking like the whole thing is starting to be a little cheesy at this point, right? So it's okay.
Cheese with our tea? I love it.
Exactly. Cheese with our tea. We've got to get a little salami to go in there too. All right, everybody. Yeah. So Kahoot is an interesting story, right? It's agrees. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about what I know about Kahoot.
Yeah, so Kahoot, who they themselves had been acquiring companies, they picked up Actimo, they picked up a Poyo. They are a Norwegian-based organization out of Oslo, and they were a sort of gaming learning company, right? And they are combining that. They're taking their gaming experience and making learning fun. I know that's used a lot, but it does show that they have the right background for that. And it's clear that this is very important because they have been acquired by an investor consortium for $1.72 billion with the B from a group that includes Goldman Sachs, General Atlantic, and some others. So this is clearly an area where people are saying this is important. This is an area of growth.
Yeah, I mean, Kahoot's been around since about 2012, so they're not brand new to the market. And many of you might know them if you played some of those games during the COVID crisis, right? When we were all at home and trying to figure out ways to engage each other, where they did a lot of virtual gaming tools like bingo and word says and stuff like that. I actually used it. If anybody attended my book launching event, I know many people who are out there listening were at that event, and it was like a trivia for 1997, the year, which is the year that we started the annual HR system survey. So we were doing a whole bunch of stuff off of that. So yeah, Kahoot really is much more of a elementary, high school education conversation. But the reason I wanted to bring it into education is it is surprisingly used in a lot of education programs at the corporate level, particularly for small businesses and medium-sized businesses who are trying to create engaging learning in the onboarding space or in their product areas or even to their customer environment. And what we're seeing is those kind of tools like Kahoot are garnering huge amounts of investment from the business industries. And I think what's going to be really interesting is as we shift the younger generations into the workforces, that's the kind of learning they're used to, right? I mean, you and I, Cliff, was Oregon Trail, which was all text across the screen, right? You might have been a little bit young for that, but for me, that was it, right? Like it was text on a screen. So the idea of having a picture and an image was really exciting. Our generation that's coming up, they're used to having very interactive education programs, even in their school environments. And that's translating then into what they're expecting out of their work environment from a training perspective. And so I think this is probably a bigger deal than maybe other corporate entities might think. So if you're in the space where you've got to think about onboarding, learning, education, development inside your organization, looking to tools like this might be worth a little bit of a conversation. It's ultimately, I think, the biggest risk sometimes when it comes to education is thinking that market is stagnant. And I think we're going to be seeing our annual HR system survey data is coming out. I would not discount the importance of learning based off of what we're seeing already.
Great point. And no, I was the right age. I taught me valuable lessons, which is why I have not died of dysentery, thanks to Oregon Trail.
You're in luck, right?
Still alive. But yeah, it clearly shows a level of importance that's in the mind's eye of people that are backing it. They're putting their dollars where they believe there's very much a growth industry, or at least an area where they see opportunity. And I think that really leads us well into this next story, also about some raising money, not as much, but still 25 million, certainly nothing to sneeze at from my end. And that was 25 million that has been raised in Series A funding for Prolific out of London. I promise London, here they are. Or at least they're UK based. So what they do is ethical research and AI training. And I think it's the AI training that is becoming so important right now, right? Because by having real humans that, are who they say they are, being able to provide answers and provide guidance and provide training to AI programs, that helps these AI programs avoid, quoting here, inaccuracy, bias, and copyright challenges. And as we're going to talk about a little later, this is certainly a real concern, right? And the money wouldn't be there if it weren't so important. And I believe, Prolific as well. I think it's just shows that there's all this talk too about job replacement, but then we also think about what are these new jobs? Well, there's jobs in training AI and in working with AI and with new companies that work with these products. I find that very interesting too.
Yeah, I think I love any company that deals with research and data, and Prolific is one of those companies. But I think, again, sort of on that flip side of what we're seeing, like with the Kahoot investment, this investment is definitely heading towards, I think, the more exciting world of AI, but it's not heading in sort of the traditional space, right? It's looking at it from a sort of training, thinking differently about the job roles, the skills. That's, I think, an area where we're not quite sure yet what it's going to look like. But I do think that organizations who are investing in figuring that out are definitely going to be a bit ahead of the game. And I think as our listeners are trying to make decisions about what they're doing with their investment dollars when it comes to artificial intelligence and or any solutions that are backed by artificial intelligence, make sure there's a percentage of that investment that's not just going towards the tech itself, but towards the education and the ethical thinking about it. Make sure your budget includes those kind of things, I think, is because I think it's real easy to get excited about how much you can automate some work and forget about how much you might be picking up bad examples of content, or you might be putting your own IP or your own company's innovation at risk because of it, right?
Yeah, extremely major concern, and why it's very important, of course, to sort of know about how these systems work, at least in a basic level, as they become more used. And speaking of, this is a story that I think a lot of you listening may have seen, or at least seen referenced. And that is a story about how ChatGPT, and I believe some other AI programs as well, AI-backed programs, seems to be getting less accurate. So both Stacey and I saw this, and I remember one that jumped out to me, and this was researchers. These are from Stanford. They're from Cal Berkeley. So, this is at this point on peer-reviewed paper. So this is early, but it wasn't from an open access journal. And so we wanted to dive a little deeper into this sort of major headline, because the major headline to me was identification of prime numbers, for example. Is this number prime? And just from March to June, the accuracy rate fell from 98% to 2%. That's
and we should mention that's on OpenAI's ChatGPT, the one that everybody's using. This isn't just AI in general, right?
That's right. GPT-4 specifically is what they were looking at. So that is so important, I think, for illustrating this idea of, well, why is what we just talked about, like with Prolific, why is it so important to train our models on the right data? Because just like anything else that we've done in HR, when we're talking about predictive modeling or using our own trending data, we need to understand what goes into that to understand the outputs that come out of it. And it's also important, I think, to always look a little deeper into these stories because there is definitely some scary headlines, but I think the takeaway is to think about how you're using AI in your organization and how you're sort of feeding the data in, right?
Yeah, and this fits along with the legislation that was just passed in New York. I think the New York legislation was really vague and it's going to have a lot of pushback on it. But this idea that you have to have a process, a tool, or an audit approach in place to basically review your AI's performance the same way that you're reviewing your employees' performance. If they're doing tasks, if they're automating things for you, and they are learning, which means that they have the capacity to change. It's not a ones and zeros where they do whatever you tell them to do, right? Then you really need to have something that's watching that change happen and auditing it. And I think that's the piece that we're very excited about, something that's able to take work off our plate. And I love the idea. I equate it to, you get someone new in the job and you're like, great, they can take the work off the plate. But all of a sudden, about 6 months in, you realize they forgot to hit that one checkbox that now requires you to go back and do hundreds of hours of additional work. That's kind of what we're starting to see, that these tools, once they get out into the open, not just the training data isn't clean, but the feedback loops aren't good either. And that's the other part of that process, that it needs to keep ensuring that it's got valid, optimal responses. And that's a real approach that we're going to have to think about differently in the market, right?
Yeah. And there's been a number of news items within the HR space and the business world and anywhere outside of already people are finding out how to game these large language models, these sort of generative AI models, by feeding massive amounts of publicly available, quote unquote, scrapable data. And that can affect the outcomes in ways that can be beneficial to a small group and are not reflective of the larger truth. And we get into a danger of any new tool that comes out. And as Stacey just said, of course, we love the idea of being able to be more productive and being able to do more. And it can be very sort of addictive, but whenever there's a new tool, we have to think about, okay, what are the limitations of that tool too? Not just the positive aspects. I know we like to focus on the positive and thinking about all the different ways it can help us, but that doesn't mean we should ever discount and ask the right questions when we're going in and buying or seeing new features added to our products, of being able to ask the right questions of where does this data come from? How is it checked? How is it verified? How is it validated? And just understanding what goes in, and also just double checking. Whenever we use AI, for instance, and these types of tools within our own work here at Sapient Insights Group, we always take the time to check against anything we can find in a way that might cause more work at the beginning, but allows us to safely treat any information we get down the road with a little more confidence. And it's good to do that every once in a while with anything we're doing, right? Every once in a while, break out the calculator, make sure Excel's telling the truth. I had no reason to ever doubt it, but I'll bet you anything at the beginning, whenever new calculating effects came on, I remember when computers could only calculate to a certain number of digits, right? And so things would get off wrong even in the banking industry. So just sort of cautionary tales about this, even though, again, I always like to think about the positive aspects of these new and exciting technologies coming out.
Yeah.
So with that being said, I want to talk about another story. And again, all these stories we've talked about, we wanted to kind of dive in and look at some of the nuances on this. All these stories are linked in the show notes. You can find them there. You can reach out if you're not seeing something directly to us. But this story is one that I found pretty interesting. I know you did too, Stacey. Both of us have been talking about this. And it's a story about, and it came from Crosscheck Data Labs. I want to make that clear because that will come up in a minute. But it's about a rise in what they see as job applicants misrepresenting themselves during the reference checking process. The number they throw out is that it's gone up fourfold. And they're looking at data points between January of 2021 and May of 2023, and found the candidates from their research were almost 4 times more likely to misrepresent things like where they worked before or where there were gaps in employment. And they do make a point that in certain industries, this can be very critical, such as healthcare, transportation, in some of the public and safety sectors. And yeah, I agree. I think it's a pretty interesting story. And I always like to talk about recruiting because that's part of my background as well. And Stacey, I don't know if you want to talk about this because I don't want to make this a regular segment, but I did want to kind of get on my researcher soapbox because I think there's something that both of us had noticed. And it's just that, go ahead.
Well, I think let's just say, I think there's a real valid place for research done by specific vendors because they want to understand their own data sets and they're very valid. And sometimes they go into third-party marketing and we love to see data that can be validated and double checked. And I think this is one of those cases where I would love to see another entity validate and check this. But I think the reason this makes you uncomfortable, Cliff, is that cross-check sells reference checking, right? So that data is a little self-serving, it would be my sense, right?
Yeah, and it may be accurate, right? It is accurate as far as we know. There's no reason to doubt it. But their interpretations of the data may be different than someone else's might be, given the same data. Now, one of the takeaways that they saw from it is that, and I'm going to quote from their own article here, that they're talking about, for example, this is their quote, our research uncovered job candidate fraud across school system, healthcare organizations, as well as in financial institutions. The potential for nefarious activity can lead to significant harm, even without a single bad actor being hired. Totally fine with that. The problem I had was later on, the quote was, the reality is only some people are more productive working remotely. I think that this is slightly sort of jumping on to a fear a lot of us have as employers when we're hiring about remote workers. And I'm worried that it feeds into a narrative that there's higher instances of fraud among remote workers as sort of in-office workers. And my stance is, here's another interpretation, that the system, and this is actually in a weird way very positive about CrossCheck's platform, the systems are getting better at detecting fraud just across the board, right? Mm-hmm. This is an AI-backed system as well. It's able to look over larger instances, find different areas of discrepancy. And so you just notice things more, right? And so that will make it seem like fraud's going up, but really it's just the system is it's better at detecting instances of quote unquote fraud. And also, although I agree with what they had said earlier about the healthcare industry and school systems, I think I would like to call upon my recruiting experience. And we would often talk to companies, as I worked for an RPO, right? A company does recruiting for others, and think about, is it so bad if someone maybe moves some dates around or doesn't mention everywhere they've worked during, for instance, the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010, people would take jobs working at things that were maybe below them the way they viewed it. They were working at fast food restaurants or retail just to make ends meet. And when they go back in to high-level executive jobs or whatever they were at, maybe they don't put that on their resume. Is that fraud? That's a broader discussion, and that may be flagged as such, but in that case, it's more like irrelevant to the job, right? It is not important information to know, right? And you don't want to clutter up a resume with thousands of little jobs. Most of us don't even mention lawn mowing that we've done once we've reached a certain age because it's no longer relevant to the work we're trying to do. And it could be seen as fraudulent. And I just want to ask companies to think about what's important for their job. Certainly, certain jobs need to stress different areas of a background check more than certain other jobs would. And, that's the end of my soapbox there. Will not be a recurring segment.
Yeah, I think it's an important component. I will have to say, again, you were saying what the professionals felt was a job that was beneath them. We do not, every job is important. The one thing that I have learned a long time ago. So let's just put that caveat out there. But I think it's a reality check, right? Like I had during COVID, my next door neighbor, amazing man, was basically not laid off, but basically his workload had been cut in half. And he kindly came over and he's like, hey, I noticed that your yard, you're not getting it cut as often. He goes, I could cut your yard for you for X amount a month. Would that help you out? I was like, that is amazing because I lost my yard guy. I'm not very good about cutting my own yard. And then 2 months later, he got a new CEO job at a nonprofit. I'm pretty sure he did not put my yard cutting job on his resume. But I think beside that point, there is this fear of hiring by distance or hiring international, that you might be getting some different information. I do think the background checking is really important, but I also think that we have to acknowledge that the work is changing and the work environment is changing, which means we may have to think differently about how we're also checking these things as well and what we think is relevant, which I think is where you were heading with it, Cliff, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, again, I just like to, partly just from being in the research space, always getting people to think about what is the source, what is the reason for that, and make your own judgments. And you'll probably notice that we try and just sort of present the information. We talk about it a little bit, but we don't try and say this is good or bad on any of these products, but it's information to consider. We trust in you to do that. We just like to provide that information out there, right? That's the tea that we've got. But I do like this idea of continuing the discussion about the remote worker, because as much as we have seen some really hot topics come up on ChatGPT and AI and all these new things, and as you said, there'll be probably more learning and more other areas that we're going to see are sort of coming back up or rising in interest. Another one that we shouldn't forget is that the remote worker is not going away. In fact, we've seen rises in that. And one of the interesting side effects of that was found in a story also from the UK. So keep in mind, these are studies done by UK and European specific based research firms, but they've seen a large rise in employers of record, mostly, but again, by their own estimation, due to the rise in remote workers. The data that they had was that the employer of record market in the last 2 years has grown a lot and will continue to grow at 6.5% per year. They estimate it to go all the way up that much, 6.5% per year to 2029. How many years is that? 2029. All right. Not 6 digits. So that's pretty interesting because it does make sense. I could see that happening because as more people are hiring remotely, they need the guidance from an employee of record for payment and local laws and anything else that could be handled for those remote workers, especially when it's in foreign country. And just with the caveat again that Europe has its own rules on what is allowed and not allowed for non-EU citizens. And so that there will be more growth for firms that can provide that over there than you might see in North America. But I think it's always worth discussing the employer record model and other sort of HR outsourcing models. You and I talked about that in the small business paper as well, right, Stacey?
Yeah, I think it's really relevant that whether you're in a very small company or a mid-market sized company, that to understand, and even large companies who just don't have the wherewithal to create an entity inside of a country, right? Setting up an entity in mainland China is massive amounts of investment or organization. And yet, if you want to have employees in mainland China, you have to have an entity there, right? And so an employer of record allows organizations to address that issue by having those employees basically work for that employer of record and then do the work for the company who has hired the AOR to basically source that candidate for them. But it's a direct source. What I think is a bit of the challenge in the States is sometimes we mix up the term with PEO, which professional employer service, which is a co-employment model. And that's actually illegal in a lot of countries. I think it's the States, maybe a few others might be the only ones that actually allow you to do a co-employment. In other countries, because of tax purposes and benefits and making sure that people have access to workers' compensation, all those kind of things at an appropriate level, they require that there's a single employer that is responsible for that employee and that employee's in the process. But I think the conversation you were having, which is there's not a one way fits all when it comes to creating basically your employment model for your organization. Outside of this, we also have gig worker models increasing, right? Which is a little different model. You have AMS, which is sort of other areas where we're seeing organizations sort of outsource pieces and parts of their employment, but not all of it. I do think we're creating much more unique and innovative ways to create new forms of employment. Now, the other big conversation that comes around this is then where do the employees get their benefits from? Where do they get their security from? Who manages their tax payments and stuff? And we do, as employers, hold a lot of responsibility there. And we have to make sure that whatever tools we're using aren't skirting the legal compliance requirements just because it makes it easier for us. So I think there's also a lot of ethics that go along with this conversation too.
You couldn't be more right. You mentioned the New York laws, and that's just the beginning of whenever there is changes to the workforce, whether it's technology or changes in how we do work or demographics, regulatory issues follow. And by logic and fact, they're always going to have to play catch up. And it's important to anticipate and think about what those cases may be. And as you said, ethics, which is a separate issue. But I think the right way to do it is to think ethically, and you will always stay on the right side of the regulatory issues if you do so.
Yeah,
so
and it's probably worth noting too, some of the bigger, if you're kind of wondering what is an employer of record, some of the bigger ones are like Safeguard, you've heard of them, Papaya, some of you might have heard of them. They have partnerships with some of the bigger systems. Atlas is a new one that's out of here, the States, that's brand new. So you're hearing their names more and more in the market if you don't exactly know what they are.
Yeah, good point. And if you want a detailed breakdown, this is a callback to the beginning of the episode. Stacey's book has a very in-depth breakdown. I use it myself whenever I get confused. We all do. It's okay. So you can check that out wherever fine books are sold.
Definitions are my favorite thing because if you can remember all the acronyms and definitions in this industry, I'll tell you, have a much better mind than mine.
That's right.
Well, Cliff, is that it for today? Have we gone through all of our boiling tea?
We have. It's going to be lukewarm. So maybe it's time to put away the tea set. I'm going to keep going with this metaphor. I will never stop.
I know. We've got all these little acronyms. You guys, if you're ever done a podcast, you got all these like lists of things. They've got like ways to bring tea into your podcast. So just FYI, this isn't just us coming up with it. There's all the cheese on the scripts that we have for this too. But real quickly, as we're sort of wrapping up today for everybody, a couple of quick reminders. First of all, just thank you guys for all participating and being engaged. I think we just hit our 5,000 download. If you haven't seen our little promo video on that and want to get to know us a little bit better, we just released that out on LinkedIn. Also, survey season has wrapped up. If you follow us, you know that we run the big annual HR systems survey each year, and we run it from May till the end of July. And we just wrapped it up. And that's where Cliff and I were the last 3 days as an offsite looking at the data. Let me just tell you guys, there's nothing like looking at data. It's so much fun. 5,000 hits this year, 2,310. I think that's our final number, right, Cliff?
I am rubbing my hands together, which is not good podcasting, but I'm telling you, I'm excited.
Yes. It's a good and very clean data this year. Not that we don't always have clean data, but I think we really went through a process to understand, to be able to clean earlier and quicker, which means we're going to get to the data a little bit quicker. So we're excited about it. If you want to hear about the key findings, and that includes things like, is spending going to be up and down in the HR tech space? What is the ethical approach organizations are taking to artificial intelligence? Or maybe who the top 5 vendors are from a user experience and vendor satisfaction space in any one of the 13 categories that we track. Please join us in Las Vegas in the October 10th through the 13th. Stay through the 13th. I am the keynote opening morning session on Friday, the 13th. Is that the Friday the 13th? Wow, I did not realize that. I'm not quite sure how to feel about that, Cliff. I should have realized that earlier.
But just keep coming back.
Yeah,
just keep
that's
returning.
Right. Also, if you want to go out to our website, sign up for our newsletter to get ongoing updates on research launches and where we'll be speaking or visiting, and when you can participate in our annual survey each year, again, starting in May. Cliff and I will both be in Chicago in mid-August. So if you are in the Chicago area, we're going to be doing a dinner for a client organization on the 9th. If you're interested in connecting up with us somewhere in the Chicago area on either the 8th or the 10th, drop me a line. We're happy to maybe touch base and maybe grab lunch with someone. Please sign up for our newsletters as well. And you'll also find our new HR in Action report that we talked about this afternoon on how SMBs are using HR technology to thrive on our website, as well as our full annual HR system survey white paper. Both are in our research content store. Finally, be sure to listen to our sister HR Huddle podcast, HR We Have a Problem, hosted by our CEO, Terry Zipper. These HR Huddle episodes can be found where you find your favorite podcast. If you'd like to support those podcasts, please leave a rating and a comment. You have no idea how important they are. They really make a difference to us. To stay up to date immediately with immediate breaking HR tech news and all the behind the scenes content, you can follow myself and Cliff, as well as sapientinsights.com on LinkedIn or Twitter. And big thank you to Cliff. Thank you for always taking the time to pull together not only the content information we're going to be covering each week, thanks to our production team, including Brand Method Media Group, as well run by the amazing founder, Kelly, our marketing team, Lisa Renko, as well as Zoe Britton, who was our last week. She's moving on to a new role. So we're really excited for her. Congratulations to Zoe. And thanks to our listeners and community. We couldn't do this without you. It really does make a difference to us when you download, comment, email us about something you heard, or say that you heard our podcast. It just puts that warm part in the day in our smile and sunshine's pocket. And that's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. We hope it's been just the brew you needed to start the engines running this week. We hope everyone has a great week, and we'll get to talk to you in a few weeks. Thanks, everyone. Bye.